Welcome to this webinar. Really glad you could join us. My name is Scott Bellis. I'm the council president of your association, but I'm also a member of the Directing and Choreography Committee through Equity Council. And it's my pleasure to present you and present this webinar and welcome you to this webinar. This is the second that we've created through the Directing and Choreography Committee. Our first one was on negotiating with producers, and we're really pleased to be able to deliver this one to you as well. And we hope that there will be more to come in the future. This is all about room and community agreements and related strategies. I've got a couple of items of business that I'd like to get through first of all. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Vancouver today, and Vancouver is situated on the traditional unceded territories of the Squamish Nation, the Musqueam Nation, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. These people and other peoples of the Salish Sea have had the custodianship of the lands and waters of this region for many thousands of years. Their relationship to the lands and waters is continuing to this day. Let us please never forget it. I'm just going to read Equity's statement of affirmation. This is a statement that we share at all of our public events, and it goes like this. Equity embraces an open and inclusive environment and encourages respectful behavior that affirms the dignity of all individuals. Equity further recognizes our shared responsibility for vigilance in creating and maintaining this environment. Equity also recognizes a shared history with Indigenous, First Nations, and Inuit peoples in Canada. In honor of those who have gone before us, Equity commits to working toward understanding and actionable practices of reconciliation. If you happen to know the First Nations territory that you're in today and you'd care to share it in the chat, please do so. I'd like to move on then and introduce our moderator and our panelists for today. First of all, our moderator today is Vanessa Porteous. Vanessa is based in Calgary and is a theater maker whose practice is rooted in directing plays and opera. A major career focus has been on new Canadian works, which she has worked on in various dramaturgical and directorial capacities. Lately, her trajectory has expanded to include filmmaking, writing, translation, teaching, and arts consulting. For many years, Vanessa was the artistic director at Alberta Theatre Projects in Calgary. After a decade as their dramaturg as well. She's a member of the committee that created this webinar, the Directing and Choreography Committee, and is a member of LMDA, CGDC, ACCA, and an individual member of PACT. Welcome, Vanessa. It's great to have you with us. I'm going to move along now and tell you about our great panelists today. First up is Nina Lee Aquino. Nina is a Filipino-Canadian, is a renowned director, dramaturge, and artistic leader. Her journey began as the artistic director of Fujian Asian Canadian Theatre, where she organized the first Asian Canadian Theatre Conference and edited an anthology of Canadian Asian plays and co-edited an award-winning book on that subject. She became the AD at Cahoots Theatre Company and Factory Theatre, both in Toronto, leading to her current role as the artistic director of English Theatre at the National Arts Centre in Ottawa. Next up is Daryl Cloran. Daryl is the artistic director of the Citadel Theatre in Edmonton and has built an international reputation for that company, which has included hosting productions of Hadestown, Six, the musical, and Peter Pan Goes Wrong, previous to all of their Broadway runs. Daryl's Beatle-infused adaptation of As You Like It has been seen at theaters across Canada and the US. And His work has also been seen in countries such as South Africa and Bosnia Herzegovina. Next up, Daryl is directing Sense and Sensibility at the Stratford Festival. Welcome, Daryl. And we have also with us today, we are lucky to have with us today, Jenna Rodgers. Jenna is a mixed race dramaturg and director. She is the artistic director of Concrete Theater in Edmonton. She is also the director of the Arts Trek program at Theatre Alberta and board co-chair for LMDA, which is the Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas. She was the founding AD of Chromatic Theatre in Calgary and serves as the dramaturg. She served as the dramaturg for the Playwrights Lab at the Banff Centre for the Arts for 10 years. She is a recipient of the Canada Council's John Hirsch Prize and is a passionate advocate for equity in the arts, a fierce supporter of new play development, and is learning to raise small, responsible humans while maintaining a career in the arts. That's a lot. All right. Well, thank you all so much, Vanessa and our panelists for being here today. I will now step aside and I look forward to the conversation to come. I hand over to you, Vanessa. Thanks very much. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Scott, for those introductions and those preliminaries. It's great to see so many people in the Zoom room. Thank you all very much for taking time to come. And I'd like to thank the panelists in advance for also sharing your thoughts and feelings and experiences on this topic with us. To get us going, I thought I'd provide or offer a few framing thoughts, and then we'll go into a discussion, conversation, where I'm going to prompt with some questions to Nina, Jenna, and Daryl. And I'm also going to invite the three of you to ask each other questions as they come up so that we can diversify and multiply some of the insights here. And then for the final step of our time together, we'll open it up to questions from our attendees. We've received a few questions in advance, and I'm going to try to incorporate those into our the first part of our discussion. So Jenna, Nina, and Daryl, I'm just saying out loud that I want to make sure I ask you those questions. In the past shortish number of years, though they aren't universal, room agreements, or also known as community agreements, have become an emerging practice in our rehearsal and creation processes in both professional settings and learning environments. I think it depends on where you are, where you're located both geographically and within the profession as to how often you're encountering this practice. I'm seeing it quite often in my world. The methods that we use to create a room agreement are as individual as the artist who leads the process. And that's because by design, each room agreement is meant to express the particular ensemble who authors it and reflect the specific circumstances of the project. Still, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to offer a definition. Let's think of a room or community agreement as, roughly speaking, a written list of values and precepts for the process, generated at least in part by the working team during one of the first sessions, that gets posted in the space to guide our work. If you're wondering how to take charge of this process yourself, Equity has a great step-by-step guide, and Randy has just posted it, the link to that guide, in the chat. Now, I wasn't able to find like the ultimate history article or Wikipedia article about the origins and history of community agreements. I was curious. If you know this, let me know. However, from what I can tell, the practice seems to have emerged from fields adjacent to our own, fields where groups come together for a particular purpose or outcome, a deliverable, but in which it's important that even though people may come from a variety of experiences and may not know each other a lot yet, everyone involved feels easy enough to try new things, to share themselves, to reveal themselves and their feelings, to challenge each other's ideas politely and without lingering repercussion, and basically to contribute from their full selves. So it seems to be a practice that's emerged in those contexts. Usually, ethics and values are part of that project, whatever it is, somehow, and emotions, and there's some kind of personal stake for the participants. Fields like community action, learning settings, and social action use justice seeking, equity seeking action. Those fields use versions of this practice as well. A community agreement is a way for a group to come together to begin. So for directors who want to lead a good creative room, starting well has always been part of the work, I would say. There's always an early phase in which info is shared, core expectations and goals for the work are framed for the group. A common working language starts to form. Key values and principles are articulated or intuited. And some sense of team or ensemble begins to be forged. And often that work is done in a kind of meeting format with a list of announcements, with some speeches by various people in charge in various capacities. Then maybe there's a reading and a design presentation, and we suss each other out artistically somewhat during that process. We start to learn each other's where we're coming from. And we all get a sense of the material that we're going to contend with as a group. And then informally, sometimes on the coffee breaks or at the mixer at the end of the day, we learn a lot about each other and the spoken and the unspoken values and dynamics that we're going to rely on to get the work done. And often we figure out our operating principles in the cracks between the items on the day's agenda. And it's possible when we work in that way, when we begin in that way, that the understanding and the consent of the ensemble regarding how things are going to operate is assumed rather than discussed or sought or fleshed out. And maybe sometimes we say our surface level expectations and goals out loud to each other, things like the schedule, off book day, the warm up, even the style or the manner in which we're going to work. But we rely on assumptions and maybe some unspoken expectations when it comes to how we're actually going to work with each other. And maybe there's some risk in approaching our work together that way, especially as we are often working with a new team. So there may be people who are familiar to us in our ensemble with whom we've worked for years, but almost always in our theater practice, there's some new people too. And maybe this constellation of humans has never met before together to work on a project. Unless we're in a repertory company, we come from different experiences. And what looks and sounds one way to one person might look or sound or feel very different to another. So, by taking some time to put words around the values that are going to guide our work as an ensemble, I think what we're trying to achieve when we use a room agreement or community agreement structure, we're trying to make it more possible to achieve our shared dream of an open, comfortable, collegial, productive vibe, that vibe of true exploration, which is usefully informed by multiple perspectives. A room agreement is one current practice, one current way that we use to shape that critical early phase of a good creative process. Now, people can have varying experiences and opinions about community agreements. We all do, and that's cool. That said, I'm not super interested in using our time here together to debate the pros and the cons of the community agreement in the sense of coming to some kind of consensus. Let it be resolved that room agreements are X, Y, or Z. And I guess the reason that the main reason why I think we can have a more useful conversation is because Canadian Actors Equity is a diverse group of practitioners, and that's one of our huge strengths as an association. And so we have no need to come to a resolution or a consensus on this topic. That's absolutely not something we need to work towards. Rather, in our exchanges prior to this meeting, I think I can speak for the four of us. What we're interested in is having this conversation to open ourselves up to the whys and wherefores for the thoughtful consideration of all of you attending, so that we can inform all of our practices in all of its range and diversity. So we're approaching this as a thoughtful conversation between colleagues about ways that we begin together with a particular focus on the lens of the community agreement in all of its range. That's my dream for today. And so, after talking a lot about beginning, I think it's time to move past the beginning. And I'm going to ask each of you a question. I'm always so nervous at beginning, and you can watch me doing it right now. But I'm going to start by just inviting you, each of our panelists. So I'll start with Nina. How do you do you use community agreements, and why? What does it achieve for your creative practice?
Hi, everyone. Um, uh, I do not use community agreements or room agreements, but I have had experience using them or creating them, for example, for like the school settings, in school settings when, the number of times that I have been invited to direct a production, kind of a theater conservatory or program. So that's as far as like, that's the extent to which I have had experience with room agreements. I think part of the reason why I'm on this panel is because I did pretty much, when I was asked, I said like, I don't think I'm the right person because I actually don't. I don't. I know of them. Again, I have experience like facilitating the creation of one, via like the students. But I personally, to this day, I don't have a formal, there's no ceremony or ritual or, anything of that, that I go into, to create one, for any of the shows that I've done. So, and again, I'm really happy to kind of listen in and lean in and kind of get other folks' perspective on it. But I will declare now that I do not use one. And I think the why, it's a little bit like too simplistic to say, like, because I've never needed one or I don't believe in it. Like, I think it's a bit grayer than that for me. I feel like if you ask any other kind of actor that has worked with me and how I handle my rooms, they would say, no, there is one, you just don't write it out. Like, do you know what I mean? Or and again, that's great. That's great for them to kind of interpret that, and I leave that to them. So if that gives them a security, a sense of security that the way I leave the room, with or without kind of the explicit kind of like, here's a room agreement or here's a community agreement, then I'm happy. Uh, there, so yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Oh, Nina, what you've said is so fantastic and provocative. I want to live in the gray areas. I want to hear more about all the things you just said. And I've written notes, so I'm coming back to you. As we move forward, I'm just noticing Sue Huff writing in the chat something about the view panel so we can see the speaker and the ASL interpreter. Right now, Sue can only see the ASL interpreter. So I'm just saying that aloud. Randy or whoever's in designing the layout, or if you have tips to Sue for her to be able to change it in her own world, I'm going to hand that off to just change. Thanks. Thank you very much for that response. Jenna, how do you, I should have asked the question this way, Nina, by the way, but too late. How do you begin with your ensembles when you're in the directorial role or stance? And do you use room agreements or community agreements, and how and why?
I do use room agreements, and often in a way that you described, like often the theater sort of has a format in the morning where there's like equity business and then a first read, and sometimes there's like community members invited to that. But I'll often spend like the first afternoon dedicated to kind of coming up with some sort of community agreement. This might take as little as 2 hours. I know people might be like, that's a long time. I've also, for a very particular process, done it over the course of like 3 days, um, uh, which sounds funny, but I guess maybe for me, a room agreement is less and less. A room agreement is an evolving process. And as my practice has evolved, it's become a little bit less about the words that go up on the wall, though that can be helpful, and a lot more about being intentional and being intentional about the way that we gather. So I'm looking at kind of my little notes that I've made through the introduction. I think like I was introduced to the tool through another practice I have in facilitation or group building, which I think is like not unlike what Vanessa, you've talked about and what Nina's also alluded to. And for me, the process of like doing a room agreement is that I think of it as like a tool to assess rooms efficiently. So like 100 years ago when I was like working in schools and had to come in and do like an after school activity for a couple of hours, a brief room agreement or facilitation activity, let me see like, okay, who's with us today? Who needs a snack? Like what's going on? And in a really broad way, this is like a way to look at the room and be like, okay, what are everyone like needs? How do I best communicate with you throughout the process? Um, uh, who's new here? Like who's on their first equity gig? What might not be clear? How can then we as a group take care of that? Um, and ultimately, it becomes dedicating time at the beginning of the process so that I can more efficiently process or deal with things if or when we run into something that's sticky. So that like if or when we hit a snag, I go, this person has told me they like to be communicated to in this way. These are what we've said about whether or not we work on breaks. So I can approach them at this time or not. And everyone then feels like respected or like they have some sort of agency from the beginning of the process, which, I think a lot of people might feel that anyway. But what I also find that it can help with, even for the skeptical, is it's an opportunity for everyone's voice to be heard. And it can sometimes accelerate buy-in to the project. And of course, people are bought in because they've signed a contract, but once people feel listened to, they feel invested in a different way. And so that's also really helpful. Yeah, and I think I can say a handful of other things, but I think that most directly kind of answers your question. The other thing I might also say is I often also try to carve out at least 30 minutes to do another working agreement with production before tech. Yeah.
Wow. Cool. Again, so much food for thought. And I'm thinking, I want to name things. I want to say, I'm curious about in Nina's, what you said, I'm curious about the differences in experiences that you have when you're in a school environment and you're making one of those agreements. I'm also curious about the theme of what is unsaid and the true value of the unsaid in our biz. Fundamentally, we're making the invisible visible. That's what Peter Brook says the act of theater is. And so as practitioners, what is unsaid is not necessarily a gap, an absence, or an error, right? We work in a world where what is unsaid is important. And so I don't want to set this conversation up as when we don't say what our values are, that's a failing. There are other ways that we communicate to each other what the values are, what are places where we're going to touch in and make and find common ground are. And I feel like that's what you sparked for me, Nina, when you were talking about if you interviewed an actor, they would say, "Oh yeah, you have a room agreement, Nina, but you just don't write it down." And you said that, so you named the fact that there was something unspoken, but you also made us feel like there was something precious about it being unspoken. So I want to just put that in the air as a thing. And then in Jenna's, there's so many themes that we contend with when we're making theater, and especially when we're in a directorial stance or we're leading the room, around the dedicating time. You know, we could spend a year talking about time in the theater. Like, that is our most precious resource. And so what we decide to give it to identifies something as being important. And certainly when you're in a leadership position as a director, your decisions around what you're going to give time to and what you're going to give less time to could define you as a director in some ways. The preciousness of time. So Jenna also brings up the theme of the range of ways of approaching this question of how to begin. The range of time between 2 hours and 3 days, depending on the goal, the outcome, maybe depending on where we're starting from and where we need to get to, or depending on the methods that we're going to use to get there. You talk about evolving from the written. How important is the written versus how important is the assumption? The practice, the moment, the experience of having done it, does that start to become more important to what the result is than the paper outputs? It feels like I'm hearing Jenna talk about her evolution as a leader of this. And then also just the role of facilitator, assessing the group, figuring out the needs, building, like basically doing a sounding of who's in the room and where they're at and what they need. And this is one method of doing that. And of course, that role of facilitator is one of the central roles of a director or a person in the directorial stance. So those are all themes that come into this, in my view. And then the business of agency and buy-in does this, and the business of skepticism, which is a theme around community agreements. So does this process that we undertake together, what impact does it have on our collaborators in terms of their skepticism level versus their buy-in level? And what are the differences in order to achieve the best outcome? Moving on to Daryl. Daryl, do you use community agreements or how do you begin? Talk to us about your relationship to this topic and why and wherefore.
I do use community agreements, and I guess like for me personally, I find them really helpful because I often enter the room as both the director and the artistic director, and sort of the weight that comes with that, with having sort of the artistic directors in the room, and not only sort of is leading this rehearsal hall, but like has access to information about the theater and what's happening at the theater and those kinds of things. I think a lot of it for me grew out of when we were working together during COVID and really trying to navigate together how do we feel comfortable working. And I, as the artistic director, often had information about policies or was the person that could find out that kind of thing. So that sort of pledge for transparency together about how we just share daily the information, like as things change and as we work together, it sort of grew out of that. So I would say that I probably land somewhere in between Nina and Jenna as far as on the first day we'll spend an hour or so to talking about how we like to work together and how we're going to engage together. It goes on flip charts and it goes up on the wall, and it very much becomes, like Jenna was saying, a chance to sort of check in throughout the process about, are we all agreed to this? Does this still feel like a thing that we agree to, or where people are able to hold up the language and say, earlier we agreed to this, and I feel this now. So it gives us that kind of shared language and shared buy-in in a way to move forward. I always find like it exciting when a stage manager I work with often, like as we go into tech, we'll like talk to the actors before tech and say, we all agreed to this together, and now we're moving into a new room and a new process with new collaborators, which Jenna was alluding to as well. And we're gonna this still applies, or does this still apply, or how will this shift? So just giving us a place to be able to sort of check in and be together as an ensemble.
Great. Thank you, Daryl. And I'm going to do my highlighting things, sticking things on the bulletin board again. It's really potent to think about how Daryl is using a room agreement practice to address some of the challenges and make the most of some of the opportunities when he's in a dual role. So when he's the AD and the director of the creative process inside the room. And I'm going to want to hear more about how this process helps you get what you're looking for. When you realized, oh gosh, I'm both people for these people. Like I'm both these people. And my method to make that work for everybody is the community agreement. I want to hear more about that. I'm also struck by this idea of something that happened during COVID for all of us and the impact of that experience on our practice and also on our spirits, on our way, on our lives, our emotions, our feelings, and what it was like to be apart from each other for a while there, quite a while, to feel precarity coming our way, and also to have an enforced time of reflection because we couldn't just be making shows anymore. So a lot of larger questions, it seems to me, suddenly had room to bubble up inside of the community. And I think a lot of things have come into our minds since that time. And now we're back, many of us or some of us, we're back doing things like we used to do, making plays for audiences. And but there's more in our minds, and I feel like there's so much to digest about that passage of time of COVID and after COVID. It sounds like for Daryl, there were questions around transparency, which has something to do with status and hierarchy and voice. So those and policies, you also mentioned policies. So things that are kind of extreme around the edges of our practice, like our day-to-day inside the rehearsal hall, but that affect the way we do our practice. That all started to emerge as stuff we wanted to kind of contend with, I think. And then I'm super curious about this going into tech. Yeah, like Jenna's going to have a working agreement with the production team. I want to hear more about that. And Daryl's going to check in with his ensemble of performers and stage management as they move into the new room and check in to see how the agreement's going to stand up, or does it need to be changed, or do we just know so much it's in the unspoken now and we could just kind of flow. I just, that's super fascinating to me that when we move into that final phase, like what happens to that room agreement when the stakes go up. So I want to ask about all those things, but obviously can't ask them about them all at once. So I want to go back. Where do I want to go start? I want to ask you, Jenna, what do I want to ask you first? What are some of the elements, what the content? Let's talk about content. What are some of the things one wants to bring into the room agreement? Either super specific or just sort of, what are the animals in that zoo? What do you like to make sure that your ensemble thinks about in the process of making that room agreement, or fleshes out or addresses?
I tend to kind of go in with 3 buckets, and I might ask a bunch of questions to get to those buckets. But there, I guess one bucket is sort of like, why here, why now? Like, why do we do this craft and what do we love about it? And what keeps you coming back here? How, like, what's your relationship with the theater right now? That vibe. Um, um, and then, oh, one of them is like, what are you worried about? Like, I want to suss out what nerves people might have around the project, the building, the institution, their lives. Like sometimes people have worries about like, I don't know, a pet being sick or significant other in their life or recent breakup, like, so just knowing that, but it's not that it's necessarily my business, but sometimes it comes in weird ways. And sometimes it's also ended up being content. Like I once did a play that had a bit with a snake jumping out of a picnic basket, and one of our actors had a phobia of snakes. So then we knew that on the first day and could be like, this is how we're going to handle it backstage. This is how that prop is going to be. This is how that actor will never have to touch that prop. Blah, 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 which sounds really funny, but just being like, what are you worried about? Opens the door for a lot. And then the third bucket is like, what do you need? Um, uh, and a lot of this is a lot of what fits into that bucket is, I think, a lot of our unspoken stuff, but occasionally something really pertinent comes up. But what do you need is like, yeah, what do you need to do your job? Do you need the room open half an hour before to warm up? Do you need people to like not interrupt you? Do you need like what sets you off? Do you uh, like a stage manager being like, please don't make me do all your dishes. But it's an avenue to sort of say like, breaks are precious to me. Don't bug me on breaks. Um, and that makes it sound like a bunch of negative things might come up or a bunch of don'ts. But it like, if I think facilitated well, it feels like a robust conversation about how we are going to make work. And yeah, so those are, I think, the three buckets that I would say the conversation falls into. Does that answer the question, or is there something else I'm missing?
No, that's great. But can you repeat the first bucket? Because I was panicking about what question I was going to ask next. So just say it again.
The first one was sort of like, why here, why now? Why are you doing theater? Why do we love it? Like, what do we have in common? What brings us into this room together?
And in terms of the deliverable, do your sticky notes tend to end up in those three buckets, or is there like another phase of transformation so that it becomes like 10 commandments or something? Or is it like, this is what why we're here, why we're now? This is what some of the things we're worried about, and this is some of the things we need. How
Yeah, I
close to
think,
the final outcome is that discussion?
yeah, you've alluded to like a process I used to do, which is like I used to hand out piles of sticky notes and then get people to like write them and color code them. And then we could put them up into the wall in kind of buckets, but we didn't necessarily know who wrote them. Um, I have shied away from that a little bit lately, mostly because like I found the sticky notes to eventually be distracting and really difficult to transfer from room to room. Very logistical, boring things. But what is important to me or where I would pull the agreements from is usually using the framework of like why we do theater, the sort of like joy, the respect, the community building, like all of those positives. I would use those to then like create the turns of phrases that outline the boundaries around like what we need or how we will come together to support each other through our nervousness.
So you almost write like you then have a process of filter transformation
Yes.
from three buckets into a constitutional document that
Yeah.
represents the input from the community. And do you do that turnaround one night? Like, is it tomorrow morning that you're going to put it up on the wall, or?
Well, we usually do it together. That's why I say a
Ah,
minimum of 2 hours. Like
ah.
we do it together and we might decide whether it's important that they're all action word kind of community statements or whether everything starts with, we will do this, or whether whatever. And I was feeling kind of tired of these and skeptical of them a little bit myself, not the conversation, but of the document on the wall. So like I'm working on a show right now that features Poirot. So we took this really robust conversation. And I said, if we could condense the ethos of what we said into like an acronym, what does Poirot stand for? So the working agreement on our wall this time is just the word Poirot, and each of the letters means something that alludes to a bigger conversation. And I don't know if it is more effective or less effective, but it is what felt right in the moment for this group of people, to take the big ideas and sort of condense them down in a process that allowed us to move forward. So, yeah.
Fun. So there's a creative aspect to this. There's a in Jenna's practice, there's a certain playfulness, at least the way you're describing writing a poem where every line of the poem starts with the first a letter from the word Poirot, which might have an effect in terms of I mean, guess we'll find out as you finish the process. And then I also want to point out this question of logistics and specificity, like when Jenna mentions, my breaks are sacred, or I'm scared of snakes. It's good to keep those as examples of what could be in a room agreement in our mind. Because I think sometimes we think of these documents or these documents as kind of like, we will all be very kind to each other, or we will all, but it can get really nitty gritty. And that's when it, I think, really has an impact on the future ensemble work, because you can, and it leads to action. Like, we're going to handle the prop a certain way. We're going to put it in a certain place. We're going to, that's when it starts to be robust, as Jenna uses that word. I want to totally change the theme for a second. Nina, talk to me about what you aim for as an artist and a leader in your first, when you bring the group together. How do you love to begin? How do you know it's a good beginning? What do you want to have happen? Or describe moments on the good first day where you're like, oh yeah. Talk to me about how you begin.
I guess for me, I will always anchor it in the work, right? So as Jenna said, like, why are we here? And it's obvious, like, we're here because, the script, we're putting together a production. And so the script, the acting, the design, like, I see those as all contributing, like, factors to, like, what we're all going to be creating collectively. So, like, my process, even before I begin first day of rehearsal, and I've done this practice since, I think, 2005 or 6, is what I call kind of poking the actor. And this was actually advice that was handed down to me, and I kind of made it kind of my own. But, by another, I'm starting out then, rookie director, and a really established director kind of mentioned it to me, and I'm like, I'm gonna co-opt that and, make it my own. But it was, back in the day where, like, the kind of director that I looked like, being a woman, being a young looking woman, being a brown person, and really, to me, like, being able to direct like BIPOC actors, no problem. But the anxiety that I was going through in directing my first white actor, that was when I go, like, I can't go into the room feeling like this. So again, the advice that was given to me, why don't you take that actor out for coffee and explain to that actor kind of how you work, and get the vibe from him or her, from them, in that sense. So I'm like, great. And so from that point on, actually, I do that with any actors. So that's part of my prep, is that I do meet with actors. Once the cast is confirmed, contracts are out and signed, I do meet with I have a one-on-one meeting with every single one of the actors that have not worked with me. And we go for a coffee in person or virtual. And again, I ask the actor that I'm meeting with to not prepare anything. I will say right off the bat, if this really is a meeting to introduce myself and to talk about my process, which kind of I have broken, broken down for myself, like, this can happen, this might potentially happen. Here's just a general sketch of how I work, and then field their questions. But we'll always, like, I'm not promising any answers at this point. That's what rehearsal is for. But would love to know what you're wondering about, sure. And I will, the only promise I can do is answer it to the best of my ability for now. Or that I'll take note of your questions. But that is the opportunity in those one-on-ones for the actor, for me to allow them to talk about themselves and, what works best for them. So usually, they're the ones that, like, I have a learning disability. Right off the bat too, I already declare that, like, what my disabilities are. So that's when I'll find out, like, if the actor, for example, has a hard time memorizing, it's like, so then I'll note for myself, this actor will have the script right up until tech, and so don't panic, Nina. But it also will allow me to tell the stage manager, so and so, just so you know, we'll have the script, so little things like that. So it's just, for me, it's just getting to know their quirks, but they're also getting to know my quirks as well, as how I my vocabulary, how I blah, 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 yeah. And so I kind of have those meetings, a month, 2 months, prior to the rehearsal, give them my phone number, and then away we go. And so, I think I'm happy to say that I think 97% of those one-on-ones have been really successful. There's only like a couple where we had that one-on-one and yet you're still a dick. And that happens, right? Like, and that's the thing. Like, it doesn't matter what you write on the wall or what you agree to. If there's an asshole in the process, always an asshole. It doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter whether they say, yeah, sure, sounds great, and then it's really not. But at least the way that kind of I've been doing, so each actor knows prior to coming into my first day what to expect, even what first day means to me. So I do tell them, like, this is what's going to happen. Usually, again, at least give them a sense, a sketch, even though there's going to be changes. Everybody kind of knows what to expect, their responsibilities in the room, what I expect of them. But they also know that I have logged in their idiosyncrasies. And again, for me as a director, I'm just already taking note. I guess that's a dramaturg in me of, like, how do I, for me, in terms of talking to them, allows me to just give a really good assessment of, like, what are the combination of buttons that I can push to bring out the best in you, and to know how do I talk to you. So when I give you notes as an actor, it's customized. It's not just like, like, this is generally how I talk, when I give notes, but I also, knowing if I am getting to know your quirks and your idiosyncrasies, then I also am getting to know, again, if you have certain disabilities or hearing or blah, 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 like, then I can also just make note of that. So that's kind of generally, and so that when we get to on first day of rehearsal, it really is, to me, about the work. It's about like, what we're about to go into, talking about all the valuable, but still framing it and anchoring it into the world that we're about to build on the stage.
That's great, Nina. I love this. We're witnessing diversity of practice in action. I love it. But I will say that what I'm hearing is similar. Well, I'm not going to try to seek consensus, but there's a need to understand each other and know each other really fast in some ways, right? And so one of Nina's strategies is to meet with each actor one-on-one. And while Jenna is using a community agreement process, although you might also meet actors one-on-one, I do think it's worth not forgetting that. Like, that's such a good thing to do. And quite often we don't, but it's really good. And that the way that we learn how to do this stuff is advice handed down to me and I make it my own. That's the gold of theater, I would say. Daryl, talk to us more about how the nitty-gritty and specifics about your community agreement or room agreement process. We heard a version from Jenna. She has the 3 buckets. I want to hear another example. But you know what? Before you do that, I see Anne-Marie Woods has her hand raised. She's had it raised for a long time. Anne-Marie, is this a question that you want to ask the group? In which case we're going to get there in a bit, or is it something else? Or sometimes I raise the hand on my thing just by accident, and it might be that. Anne-Marie Woods, if you want to write a little message in the chat, please do, and we'll get to you when we can. So Daryl, tell us about your community agreement practice and or the way you like to begin. Oh, it was an accident, everyone. Great.
It sounds similar in parts to how Jenna approaches it. It's very much a conversation with some buckets, primarily around what do you need to be your best self in the rehearsal hall. So like ways that we can support. And that like definitely like as you were mentioning earlier, that conversation can range wildly from big themes like generosity and kindness to like specifics like I am allergic to peanuts, please don't have peanuts in the room. Like so that becomes quite a wide sort of conversation. And then like I touched on to just the idea of like how we like to work together, right? And that like if I'm the artistic director in a room, I feel like it helps really shift the tone, like the difference between me saying this is how I like to work to how will we work together, like to open that up to everybody and have a conversation around how do you like to engage with the work, what do you need to engage with the work, and have that kind of sort of leveling conversation where we can all be in the room together talking about the ways that we thrive best in a room, whether that be about safety, whether that be about health. And then ultimately, we have like big, we use a big flip chart and we write all the things down. And then they're like giant sticky notes that we put up on the wall, and they just live in the room with us for like through rehearsals. So there are places for people to point and refer to if there's something that we want to call back to, or if there's something we want to question or we want to like define further partway through the process. Generally, we take those off the wall and we bring them into the theater and the backstage with us as we move into the theater space, so that they remain part of the conversation. But I don't go as far as sort of distilling it into the document that Jen described. It kind of just lives in kind of point form or around us as we explore. And there are now like lots of them all over the hallways. I bump into some that are just sort of left up in the halls. And it's interesting to see how different the conversation is, like because it's a different ensemble, because it's a different piece, because it's a different time of year, like how those conversations, while there are some qualities like kindness and generosity that remain throughout, there are lots of specifics that are very much about who are the people in the room and what is the story that we're telling together.
Thanks, Daryl. I love the idea of having a look at the old documentation. Probably reveals something about how, as you say, different groups, different projects, but also how your process has evolved and changed as a facilitator in this. We have a question in the chat. I'm going to get to it in a minute here. I'm going to bring forward a couple of the questions that have come to us from in advance. How after creation, how can we keep the room agreement top of mind as the contract progresses? And I'm saying that to the group, so whoever feels like they have an impulse to answer that question.
Yeah, I can jump in. I mean, I think that Daryl's already said a little bit about like bringing it with you. Like if you've got it, I think it has to kind of travel with you a little bit, or like where does it live when the director leaves? I've seen like the green room door be a good place. I've seen backstage. So I think like if you've got a physical document, that can be really useful. I try my hardest in the first week to look at the room agreement every day and then find like in the morning when I arrive, and then I try to find a reason to refer to it specifically every day for the first week. And then other people kind of start doing it. I'm not always super successful with this. If part of the process that you decide on is a check-in, that can also be a nice way to keep the room agreement alive, because you could bring the room agreement into your check-in. But yeah, just referring to it, I think often helps keep it alive. But I agree, that can be one of the biggest challenges, is to not let it just be a piece of paper no one looks at ever again.
And I guess just to try to lift the like my understanding of the question, we want to keep it alive, not because one of the products of this experience is the room agreement, but because we want it to be useful in problem solving, for example. That would be the only reason. It's not because, like, if in an ideal world, or anyway, it's not because we made it and we want it to exist as a thing alongside the play. It's because we want it to be a mechanism that becomes useful to the group in moments when it's needed, right? So certainly I would want to be checking myself and my instinct to bring it in again, to make sure it wasn't, oh, we did all that work and now we're not ever referring to it. Maybe we're not referring to it because it's so deeply embedded. It's become our way of working together. It's not a big deal. But I want to go back to it so that it's still operational, like a policy, like a good policy, right? A good policy in a human resources sense is not, it doesn't exist in the world unless it's in action. There's no point having policy if you're not using them.
Yeah.
So how do we make this a policy? Jenna.
So, well, I guess I would also offer that it could be as simple as, like, one thing I see that comes up a lot is like the idea of like patience. Can we have like grace or patience with each other? And this is often so unspoken, but in the like, oh, it's going to take me a while to learn my lines or get my accent down or whatever. And you see those anxieties bubble up in the room. I find it useful to be like, oh, if I get really stuck directing and I start to get in my own head, to go, oh, hey, everybody, like, I'm experiencing the the need we talked about for patience in a like way I might not have explained. So can I just ask, for another 5 minutes on this break so I can kind of go over it or whatever. So to sort of see the ways in which the anxieties expressed in the room might also manifest in me. So that is often a way I might refer to it, if that helps.
So you're using it in your own, to direct your own behavior and actions in the room.
And then stating that I'm using it out
so that
loud.
there's a modeling aspect to it.
Yeah.
Daryl, do you have anything to say about how to keep at least the principles or functions alive?
Yeah, I think like certainly the modeling that Jenna's talking about, like it's certainly like to see the director use the language that we have agreed to, or model that, I think is a great way to do it. Definitely like buy-in. So like I think I mentioned sort of earlier, like I've worked with a couple of really fantastic stage managers who really engage in the room agreement, and then like it becomes part of their language as they are, whether it's welcoming the artist to the theater, or like as just part of the note that goes out with the daily schedule, that some of that language is just used as part of that, as just a subtle reinforcement of the things that we all agreed to. So the more everyone buys in early, the more it just becomes part of what you do.
Right. There's another question that felt like it came next, which is, how do you handle when someone breaks the agreement, goes against, ignores, contradicts? And I felt like in what you said, Nina, an asshole is an asshole, and only once or twice in your early meetings, maybe you didn't notice it first, or maybe you did right away, depending on how old you were at the time and how much you knew about life. You can start seeing, like, I'm not sure that anything that we agree to or put in words or write down or even just say to each other is going to mean that we can find common ground artistically and be true collaborators, right? And so I just want to name this question of limit cases. So yes, there's going to be people with whom it's never really going to be that great in terms of a collaboration. We're going to have people like that. in our careers, if we're lucky enough to have a lot of opportunities. That's going to happen. And then there's going to be people for whom there would not need to be any words on the other end of the spectrum. It's just, you find yourself just gibberishing at each other and something comes out of it. And that collaboration flows faster than words, below words. You get a shorthand going. And then there's all the rest of us in between. And so I don't necessarily want to concern myself with how do we, that we're trying to make something happen with people with whom it's almost impossible to have something happen. I think that the goal of having any kind of good beginning or assessing, establishing common language, whether we're doing it in a community agreement or not, is to give well-intentioned people who have things in common and want the same thing some tools to navigate the inevitable challenges, right? So let's not worry too much about, oh, there's going to be one or two people in a person's career that it just never, ever worked with. Let's think about each other, our well-intentioned, talented, prepared collaborators. And the question is, let me go back to it. How do we handle when someone breaks the agreement, goes against, ignores, or contradicts? So just strategies to handle that moment, those moments. And Nina, I'm going to invite you to share your thoughts, even if you're not in the world of using room agreements, but just how do you handle it when the unspoken net and, you know, that precious atmosphere that is so important to creative work is broken, not again by those star assholes, but by people who may have the best intentions, but something's gone terribly wrong.
Yeah, good question. Hard question because it's a hard answer. But really for me, you know, the assholery really for me is rooted in, you know, somebody that is taking away from the work. Again, like I will always root the process in the work. So if you are, you know, if that individual, well-intentioned or not, and again, intentions can always be good. It's just the impact of those intentions that I'm more concerned about. But, you know, if it's taking away from the joy and the challenge of the work, then, you know, I'm afraid I'm going to have one of those hard conversations. And really for me, it's always kind of a two-tier assessment. You know, is it worth it? You know, like, can I pay the cost of this with my soul? Because that means as a director and oftentimes too as the artistic director, you know, do I have enough in myself to protect the rest of the company? That includes my designers, that includes my production, and of the 3 or 4 that I've dealt with, 2 of them I have had to answer yes, you know, for whatever. But I do have to kind of have a good talk with myself because it's not easy. It's not, you know, it's like it's one of the things I loathe, and it takes a lot of courage. And again, it's like all the energy that I could have put into the script and working my actors. Now I have to deal with this. It really makes me resentful sometimes. But again, we have to do what we have to do. So if I can answer honestly that, you know, that the cost of keeping this individual in the ensemble for the sake of the story, for the sake of the work is worth it, then yeah, I have to buck up after that and really kind of do the compartmentalizing that I need to do to kind of protect the rest of the ensemble, you know, create the strategies around working with a certain individual or individuals, and then carry on. And making sure that, you know, everybody moving forward, yeah, like can live with this decision that I've made. But most often than not, if the answer is like, no, you cannot. I'm at a point now in my career where, yeah, again, it's hard to do, you know, it's hard to confront, it's hard to whatever, but after that confrontation, if that person continues to be like, nope, you know, then we have to part ways. Then I need to do the courageous thing, as much as it's like, it gives me shudders and the heebie-jeebies to kind of like either, you know what, you know, maybe this isn't working out, you know, and And if there like much damage already has been done with the fluorescent ensemble and I'm witness to that. And for me, it's also just like being able to gather the evidence and, being witness to what's happening. Then you got to do the hard thing, but it's the right thing. So to me, it's as simple as that. Again, it's just not worth the second chance or the third chance or the fourth chance. Then we have to do the right thing in this case.
Thanks. That's great. So Nina has described those situations that are so very rare, thank goodness, where we're at an extreme end of this. And I think you've explained it super vividly, and you've described the stakes, the agony, all those steps. And now I want to turn us back from that extremist moment when there's been 3, 4 chances, blah, 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 and we're in the state of like, can we go on together or not? And more towards we're in a room agreement environment, and we've got the room agreement, and someone breaks the agreement, against, ignores, and or contradicts it, and we're not at the point where it's like it's intolerable. It's just one of us goofy members of the team have screwed up in some way, and we've broken the agreement. And as the leader of the room, Jenna and Daryl, what do you do? How do you handle that?
You have to, right? Like as the director in the room, you have to address it because you've made this agreement with everyone. There are like in the sort of medium-sized examples that you're looking for. There are like you kind of have to call the audible in the moment, right? Because like sometimes it's important to address it like in with everyone who's in the room right there as the thing happens. And sometimes it's better safety wise or just for everyone's well-being to take a break and speak specifically to either the person who has made the mistake or the person that the mistake was made upon, or like, so sometimes you have to break out and deal with it separately, like to ensure everyone's safety and comfort. But even if you do that, you then need to bring it back to the group, I think, at some point to reaffirm that if this is what we agreed to and that didn't happen, this is how it's been addressed, or to give people their opportunity to speak if they need to. But yeah, ultimately, if you don't address it, then you're just opening the door for more.
Jenna, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that these things are true. Like I'm trying to come up with something that doesn't necessarily echo exactly what my colleagues have said.
Go ahead and echo though. That's good. That's cool too.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I think also maybe what's strange for me, maybe this is because I have less experience than the two of you, but I'm like, I find that I run into an outright breaking of the room agreement. I don't even know that I really have. I feel like I've run into like errors or mistakes. But the working agreement to me, like, yes, it's like these are the ways in which we're going to work together. But in many ways, like maybe the most valuable thing about a working agreement to me, like in the nuts and bolts sense, is this is how we're going to communicate with each other when things go awry. It becomes like an incredibly useful tool for me to be like, whoa, we have to pause rehearsal because something is going on here and we agreed we're going to talk about it. Or I've often said to colleagues, particularly, like, I think I'm absorbing some of Nina's sentiment about like, oh, what is it like to, be a woman of color, to present a certain way and work with like sometimes older white male actors who like are the nicest, kindest people, but also terrify me sometimes. And like, what are the tools that I need to be able to like lead well? And what are the tools they need to like be able to do their job well? And how do I hold that room? And so I think a lot of the time, like a broken room agreement to me feels like a misalignment of communication. And if communication is a value that we've maybe spoken into the room, I have a good pathway to at least start dealing with it. And if I circle about in a weird way, what I've also said to other racialized artists about like working together is if someone comes to you to tell you that there's a problem, it's because you did a good enough job setting up trust in the room. And even though it feels like, oh crap, now I have to deal with a problem, if they didn't trust you or if you didn't set up the room in a nice way, no one would have told you. So sometimes I hold on to that in the like moment of, oh crap, now I have to deal with something, because I would rather know and be able to help than not.
Yeah. I want to pause for a moment to make sure that if you have a question for each other, you can ask it or a response. Just because I see those clouds of thinking going on, but I don't need to put you on the spot. I just wanted to make sure there was space for that. I see lots of questions coming at us from various directions. I want to name the distinction between, is the room agreement a list of commandments, sort of? I mean, I don't mean to be, but is it like, we're going to do, we're going to act in the following ways, and then someone breaks it by acting against that? Or is it, do we think of it usefully as a list of ways we're going to behave, commandments? Or do we think of it usefully as a mechanism that we use to communicate? And obviously it's some kind of hybrid. But I think if you're in the position to start designing one of these, it's useful to think of those two models and where you feel you want it to be. Because what Jenna talks about is, I've never known it to be broken because it's actually given us the means to talk about problematic moments. So it's less about policing that we're obeying all the rules of the room agreement, and more like using the terms of the room agreement to address the inevitable complex moments that we face. I see Jenna reacting, and so I want to make sure I'm speaking properly for you.
Oh, you are. I was just looking for a resource that I could like maybe pop into the chat. So give me a second to do that in the background, but I want to be sure my voice isn't taking up too much time.
Well, it's all good. The other thing that I think it's around hierarchy and our own anxieties and fears, and what, as directors, if you're going to be in the directorial stance, what do you need to feel that you can using some of the language that we've heard today, hold the room? What are my tools? Nina, you talked about the origin story of your one-on-one meetings, being your anxiety when you were facing the prospect of directing your first white actor, and that a colleague shared this strategy with you and that you've adapted it to your own use. So we're talking about status, we're talking about, but we're talking about our own sense of safety as the leader of the room, our own security, building a process that we recognize as our own. And I think it's really fundamental to think of whatever you want to go forward as that. You're trying to build a process that where you recognize yourself in it, where it matters to you and it reflects your values, deeper than the values, your own personal values, regardless of what the outcome is in terms of facilitation strategy. I'm taking that away from what you guys have said so far, what you folks have said so far. Okay. We have a question. I see a question in the chat. I see two, and there's one in the Q&A, but there's one I want to get to because it was sent in early, and I think that person should be rewarded for doing that. So we're going to do that one first. I'm a disabled actor and accessibility consultant. How are you integrating access needs into your community agreements? Already heard a little bit about that, but I want to just make sure we hear a little bit more. And maybe, Nina, you talked about learning about people's disabilities and revealing or disclosing your own in those one-on-ones. But if you have anything to say about how you work with other actors around access needs, I want to hear from anyone who wants to speak to that. Daryl, what do you do? Is that like an item that's like in the forefront, or do you let it emerge? What's happening with access needs in your community agreements and ways of beginning?
Yeah, like we start that conversation from the audition process. So from the moment that like an actor submits to audition, like we're already in conversation about access needs as part of them coming to the audition, and then part of the offer would be a conversation around access needs. So we start that good and early so that there's time to address anything to make sure that when that actor arrives that they're feeling supported. Then of course as you get into the community agreement, or there other things may arise through that. We work with disability and access consultants here at the Citadel to ensure, like, both from like physical space that the space is suitable access wise, but also like just emotionally for where people need to be met. So yeah, it's got to be a super early conversation, I think, and then just a willingness, like as things come up, like a willingness to prioritize the human being and to make it work.
I want to follow up. When you say it starts in the rehearsal process, does the Citadel have like a particular practice in terms of like the forms, the intake, the outtake, but like how do you make sure that that's actually like super openly there and knowledge and able to be known
Like
by
in the audition process, like it's part of the posting, right? That that we ask people to identify what access wise what they need, or like the audition process itself. And then part of the, like, moving forward towards offer, part of that conversation then, like as an offer goes out, is an opportunity to have a conversation around access needs, so that the artist is signing up knowing that they're able to express what they need and how they'll be supported, and that we're going into that relationship knowing.
Do either of you want to add or give us any color or detail around that question from our attendant person who's here? How are you integrating access needs into your community agreements or your rooms?
Similar to Daryl, like it starts really with like how we accommodate them in auditions. I know is kind of like just a slice of what the potential it will look like in the rehearsal hall. So, which is great, which is fantastic. And again, if we are going in that direction, it starts with, it's not just a conversation with me, the director, but again, with the entire company of, what the needs are. The obvious ones, right? The obvious needs are for the actors. And then, we want to fill in the cracks and the gaps. And that's where, again, me coming in as the director, having that one-on-one with the actor, I'll be able to kind of really even finesse further. What else are the needs? And that's something like we also do now, for both the visible and invisible disabilities. There's kind of like the general broad strokey thing, and then there's the more specific to the person, but also again rooting into the work. Like, how does the disability interact with the work itself? Because again, I think sometimes it would have nothing to do with the work, or it has everything to do with the work. And so being able to bespoke the needs of that artist, because this is also what the work is going to need. Therefore, this is what the art then fantastic. So everything's like in sync, and again, it's not disconnected from what we're about to do on stage.
Mm-hmm. It's more core to the what you are always saying is the goal, right? I want to just read this follow up from the person who brought the question forward. I think as the person who asked this question, I will also add that everyone has access needs, not just disabled people. So how are you making sure that everyone feels safe to share their access needs? So I want to make sure you have a chance to respond to that with another answer or clarification. Go for
Yeah,
it.
sure. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that prompt and that reminder. I mean, I think I would answer and so I am an artistic director, but most of my experience directing has been as a freelancer. So I'm often not wearing that double hat when I come into sort of institutional spaces. So I don't always know. I mean, I'm involved in the casting process, but I don't always like know what has been handled or what has been done on the company end. So in the making of a room agreement, this sort of falls into the like broad, what do you need bucket, which I'll usually start as a broad question. And really fortunately, in the last couple of processes, I've gotten to work with some folks who are really well versed in like access needs and are like quick to be like, start that conversation. But if that conversation around access needs and the fact that everyone has them isn't organically kind of started in the room, I may plan to ask some of those questions myself, like most recently. I'm, as was said in my introduction, I'm a parent to like very young children. So currently I often have varying access needs based on, you know, their lives. They're 1 and 3. So sometimes this is like daycare and sickness is like the real realities that I'm facing all the time. And that often opens the door to other people who might have child-related things, but it also sometimes opens the door to broader things. And often one of the agreements or conversations I like to have is about how do we deal with emergent needs, because a lot of the time we might not know an access need exists until we encounter the problem. So I think I've seen this on lots of working agreements, but the idea that the agreement is ongoing, and that's about how do you keep it alive and how do you refer back to it and how do we, you know, go, oh, wait, maybe this is a new thing we need to put up on the wall to allow space for, I guess, emergence. Yeah, so you know, I don't know that ensures that everyone feels safe to share their access needs, but I hope that it's like steps that pave a pathway for the opportunity or possibility that people will.
That's great. Daryl, Nina, any thoughts you want to add on that question? Great. So with 7 minutes to go before the end of our session, not to stress about time, which is a bad habit of mine in the directorial role too. We do have some questions around. So we have some questions that have to do with the things we've already discussed, like one-on-ones. We have a question, hard to wrangle, should people be paid, or is this an acceptable part of being a contractor? I can't see getting a budget approved for that, but just wondering if you or any of the panelists have experienced pushback on pre-meetings. I'm going to read all the questions so that we have them in the air, and then we're going to hear from people in a sort of final discussion. Thoughts about bringing in outside consultants to lead the community agreement. I've heard that advocated for, decentering the director. Or in other words, what concerns do you have about leading these agreements when being the person who has the most power in the room? And I think that's related to our original Q&A. How do you directly address the embedded hierarchical structures that exist in the room, not just in words, treat everyone with respect, but in action? Modeling accountability. And then a comment. When I am a stage manager with a production, our first day usually has the formation of a room agreement. But because I'm also a stagehand general technician, I also make sure that it includes our upcoming technicians at the theater we will be performing at. I guess similar to what Jenna does. So again, this issue of people who join our working ensemble at a later stage or who have a kind of intermittent presence in the work. I think these are all incredible questions. I'm going to just leave them in the air. And I'm going to invite our panelists. We're not going to answer all these questions, folks. Sorry, I don't think. I'm going to invite you to just speak about what's on your mind now as you consider this question and as we head toward the end of our session together. Daryl, would you like to go first?
You know, I would say that the one of the most important parts of the room agreement as the director is to find that way to sort of to decenter yourself and to make sure that you are entering the process, you know, generously and collaboratively with the rest of the team. I, as a freelance director, I have been involved in a couple of processes where the community agreement was led by by somebody who wasn't the artistic director or was someone who was just brought in. Those were tricky. They weren't successful for the ones I was involved in, but mainly it was because it felt like it absolved the artistic director or the team from being a part of it. So I'd say they're totally possible, but I'd say that the goal there would then be that like everyone who's involved still needs to be there and still needs to be building this room agreement together, and you're just using the facilitator to help make that conversation go forward. But the more that you can use that first conversation to set the tone of we will work together collaboratively throughout. We all have a job. Your job is as a performer, your job as a designer, my job as a director, but we have agreed to work together to collaborate to make this happen.
Thank you, Daryl. Given the hour and a half we've had together and all the things that have been coming up in the air, I just want to invite you, Nina, to tell us what you're thinking about and what you want to share with us as we close this out.
It's funny because I think my one-on-ones, and I've not had any pushback, just to quickly answer that. So far, so good, knock on wood. If anything, I've had actors like, oh my God, that's so cool. Yes, I'd love to meet with you. And I don't meet with directors often before rehearsal. So that's been the reaction that I've had so far when I meet them. I buy them coffee if I can. I don't know. Anyway, so I think I do the opposite. If anything, like I am pretty much upfront with the actors that I am the leader of the room. So I will often say, like, yes, the room is collaborative, absolutely, but it's not democratic. Like, I am still the princess boss, or at least that's the way I frame it. And then they laugh and they chuckle and they go, see, it's like, it's not scary. But I think that often I find, if anything, there's a relief in that at the end of the day, like I'm like, come over here with me, like, let's go to this together. But like, I will be the first in line, and I will, like, I think that's the image that I kind of have in my head. Like I will own up to the leadership in the room. And yeah, I do have incredible power, I suppose, but I hope I'm using it for good. And I hope I'm using it for joy. I hope I'm using it for, that's my responsibility. So and I'm pretty upfront about that. But like, I will set the tone. I will set the structure. And yes, absolutely. If you have needs, like, I will definitely like reshape and mold that structure to everybody's needs as best as possible. But at least there's a thing that I'm hanging those needs onto. Like, I'm not starting from scratch. I'm starting from how I know the best way to work. And that's all I can guarantee, because you will, if I am able to be me in the room, then you are going to get the best of me. And these are the things that are in the room that will allow me to work, to the best possible conditions. And I'll take, pieces of you, pieces of your colleagues, and hang that onto my superstructure. So it becomes the structure of, I guess, our process. But it starts with, to me, I'm the director. So it starts with the foundation that I and my like, it even starts with me and my designers, because that's how the vision is created, right? Like, and the actors to me are kind of the final pieces of that big picture puzzle vision that we're creating. Again, contributing to the production. So, I feel like I make that really clear to the actors that I meet. And again, depending on their reaction, if they don't like what they're hearing, again, those one-on-one chats are a great way for them to get out of it. Like, if they don't like it, if they don't like me, great. Like, at least we know now, before we go into the room and you're like stuck with me. And I'm like, and if you don't like me, like, do you know what I mean? So again, those one-on-ones are just as much as an assessment of each other, of like, we're vibing, we're just getting to know one another. And if there's anything that you hear in me that you're like, I I always empower them and tell them, like the agency to kind of like walk away from this gig, like go for it, but yeah, those are end of thought.
One of the we're really, I'm going to go to Jenna, but I'm going to conclude before we go to Jenna, and in an interesting twist on the way things usually work, because I want to speak to my pleasure in this diversity of perspective and practice. I'm really appreciative of how each of you has spoken from the center of yourself and your practice, and that we have not attempted to find consensus, because this is not the purpose of this. And I think it's really important to allow dissension, fruitful, purposeful difference, dissension, and diversity in our practice. And I feel like all three of you have been modeling that. And to take us home, I'm going to turn to Jenna. What is on your mind? It doesn't have to be a conclusion. You don't have to facilitate this. That's my job. I just want to hear about where you're at as a director, artist in the theater, and what's crossing your brain pan right now.
I mean, lots of beautiful things. Like, I think I personally can get hung up in like what is right and what is wrong. And so it is nice to be regrounded in the idea of like process is individual. Um, uh, and I guess I have this like, resource keyed up that I looked for. It's an article from 2021 by an Edmonton artist named Charlie Peters. And it's about the role of the director being decentered from the idea of vision and moving towards listening and dialogue work or community building work, which I've been reflecting on a lot in this current process. I do think that like a lot of the work of the director is visioning, because it's about bringing a team together, and it's about all of the prep, and it's the fact that the set is often, built by the time you even get to rehearsal. There's no denying that. But the idea of making or mentally shifting myself to think of the role of the director as being at least 50%, if not more, community building. And that is also with the design team, with production, that you are there to facilitate a process, that you are there to like, yes, to do the work of this show, but that the work of the show itself, at least for me and in my practice, wouldn't be the show that it was without everyone's very meaningful contribution. And that the vision that I start with is rarely exactly the vision that I end with, and it's better for it. And that's how I think I feel about practice, and why some sort of facilitated conversation on how we work together feels so significant to me. But yeah, I think that can be the end of thought for me. Now I'll pop that article in the chat in case anyone is interested in looking at it.
Thanks, Jenna. And again, beautiful model of, I would say, quite different within our tiny parameters of being in the same world at the same time, quite different takes on the role of the director. And I want us not to try to harmonize them, because I think that every one of us that is in this Zoom room right now, I think our responsibility might begin with trying to understand where we stand there. What is our vision, and evolving and changing as it does, for the role that we intend to play in this creative process, and then how can we hone in around that, and then design a beginning for our process with our ensemble that allows us to be our full selves, that espouses the virtues and values that we think are important, that is easily understood by our collaborators rather than opaque and impenetrable or whatever, that has a good combo of spoken and unspoken, a good combo of vibes and like named stuff, and that is appropriate to the project in terms of its scope and its time and its artistic aims. That would sort of be like the headspace that I would want to go into my next project with when I'm thinking about how to begin. And I really want to thank everybody who's in the Zoom room here with us. Thank you for the questions, whether we were able to address them or not. Oh yeah, there's the HowlRound link. Yeah, I remember reading that. That's really good. And I want to thank Equity and especially Scott and Randy, and I want to thank our ASL interpreters for being part of this conversation as well. Scott, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, much gratitude to you, Vanessa, for guiding this incredibly fascinating conversation, and to all our amazing panelists. Yeah, I'm really grateful that we can have these conversations. As an equity counselor, I think it's really important for our working community to continue to examine how our working spaces are changing. It's a very exciting time, I think, to be working in the live performance sector in this country. As your council president, when I speak to my colleagues working in other countries, I can tell you that a conversation between members, working artists, and institutional leaders who are leading these rooms, these kinds of conversations are not happening in the same way that they're happening here right now today. And that's something that we should really, really be thankful for. This is how we build community and we build our industry moving forward. I just have a couple of other things to mention before we sign off. Thank you, everybody, for staying around. We've got like almost everybody has stayed through the whole thing. It's incredible. If you have comments or feedback about this webinar, or if you have a great idea for a future member webinar, please write to the email that I've just put in the chat, communications@caea.com. We're always looking for new ideas. And one more thing, council elections are coming up. They're right around the corner. Voting will begin, I believe, on the 11th. So please look in your emails for those, and exercise your franchise and vote for your next regional representatives to sit on your national council. On behalf of the association, many thanks to our panelists and to you, Vanessa, and to everybody who's been here. It's been a great conversation. We'll see you next time. Thank you very much.